Thanks for joining me. My name is Dave Miller. I am the Unpleasant Blind Guy. In part 2 of the series, Wolves in Sheep's Clothing, I continue with my interviews on RFB Radio, whose Monday shows can be heard at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. This time, I talked to Tim Burton, independent writer and member of the Liberty GB Party of the United Kingdom, about how the increased population of Muslims has affected his country. Tim, if you can give me a small thumbnail of where you grew up and where you wound up and the area where you are now.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was actually born in London within the sound of the Bow Bells, which technically speaking makes me a Cockney. And being the usual cheeky, cheery chappy that I am, I would normally converse with you in Cockney rhyming slang, but I'll forego that for the purposes of this interview. Good. Most of my childhood was spent in South London, in a little town called Sutton, which is about, an hour's drive from London. And when I went to college in Birmingham, which was in 1970, it was quite a different place than it is now. And I've lived in Birmingham on and off for most of my adult life. I've spent a few years in the Middle East, various countries in the Middle East, observing Muslims at work and play. And Birmingham is where I live now, in just north of Birmingham, actually, in a little district, coincidentally also called Sutton, but not the same Sutton that was near London, obviously. And I've had quite an extensive opportunity to observe Muslims at close quarters in Birmingham, and most of it's quite unpleasant.
By the way, for those who don't know, the Birmingham area, sorry Tim, I pronounced it the wrong way, is the heartland of the United Kingdom. It's more or less kind of sort of in the middle. And this is good because, of course, the refugees that are being distributed among the cities here in the United States, many are being distributed into our heartland. So talking to Tim is a valuable thing here. You've been around for a while, Tim, and is
don't rub it in.
Well, I'll try not
to. I've been around for too long, some people might say.
But what I want to get from you is a sense, first of all, of just personally your experiences with Muslims, how the number of them have increased over the years, and how Muslims have acted towards you and towards your society and your society's norms, how those actions and attitudes have changed from the time that you were a young man, newly moved into Birmingham from college, to now. You can sort of give me a thing like that. I would appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Well, when I was growing up, we hardly had any Muslims in our part of the world. I think in our entire school, and there were like 700 or 800 people there, we had one Pakistani guy. And I presume, there's a good chance his family was Muslim and that he was Muslim, but that never made a ripple as far as we were concerned. He was a Pakistani guy. He was slightly exotic because he came from Pakistan. It was the first opportunity to see people from that part of the world in our part of the world, and it was quite a novelty. And he blended in really well. He became captain of the local cricket team, and everybody thought of him as, just another nice guy, all right, from a different part of the world. We didn't think anything negative. That's the point. And when I came up to Birmingham, well, that was in 1970, and there were hardly any Muslims there. So to start with, I didn't really form an opinion about Muslims one way or the other at all. Then I went to work in the Middle East, and I worked in such places as Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, and I got the chance to see Muslims close up and personal, if you like, and I thought these people are really untidy and unhygienic, and I'm glad we don't have a lot of them over in our country. Well, imagine my surprise when I got back to the UK and started finding that in fact we were importing quite a lot of them into our country. But for many years it didn't really bother me at all. I think, well, okay, they're basically an uncivilized bunch, but we're tolerant and welcoming and civilized, and we opened up our country to them with very little fanfare. I mean, there were at that time some people who could see that this was all going to get much, much worse. Organisations like the National Front and the British National Party were making a big issue, but they weren't focusing on Muslims, they were focusing on foreigners and people who didn't look like us because of the colour of their skin. That was the wrong place to focus, but that was my experience in the 1970s, 80s and 90s, and it was only really after the Twin Towers were attacked in 2001 that I started to look into it a little bit more about what Islam was all about, and started to look around and realise we'd actually got an enormous Muslim population right here in Birmingham. I mean, I'd known about it previously, and people would say, oh, you've got to go over to this curry house in Birmingham because it's genuine Pakistani or Indian curry. You've got to try it. It's wonderful. And, you looked on these people as exotic, but you didn't really have much in the way of negative feelings towards them. But after 2001, I think an awful lot of people started asking questions about Islam, and we started to realise that, in fact, there was a problem. It took a lot of us, I think, time to realise that it was a growing problem, and that it was likely to impact on our way of life and our very civilization. I mean, that all took a while. And to start with, people, they knew that Muslims were different, and we just put it down to different cultures, and we never really worried about it. But then we started to see no-go areas developing in Birmingham, places like Alum Rock and Spark Hill, Sparkbrook, Bordersley Green. These places eventually became known as the Jihadi Triangle in Birmingham, and they were places where you did not want to go. If you were a white male, you did not want to go into these areas after about 8 o'clock in the evening, because there was a likelihood you were going to get harassed at best and possibly beaten up and hospitalised at worst. And there was a time, I don't think it happens quite so much now, but there was a time where the residents were actually posting signs up in the streets specifically saying no white males after 8 o'clock. And the police at that time realised that was likely to cause a problem, and they stamped down on that practice. So that doesn't happen so much. But we still, as white males, feel very unwelcome in those parts of Birmingham at any time of day, let alone after 8 o'clock at night. And that's my personal experience. And of course, in recent years, with the escalation of Islamic attacks around the world and the awareness that is growing that there is a huge problem with Islam, Muslims are getting much more defensive, and the unwelcoming attitude is getting worse and worse. And regular listeners to this radio show will know that back in May, just before the general election, I was on the campaign trail for Liberty GB in Birmingham, and I was actually accosted by a group of Muslims who did not like my message, which admittedly said stop Islamization. They, instead of engaging me in civilized debate, threatened me and the guy who I'd got with me as security. They threatened us both with a severe beating if we didn't get out of the area, and they stole my property, my campaign board. And when I complained to the police and said, well, this shouldn't be happening in the 21st century, if in our country, if somebody has a disagreement with you, they can have a civilized debate, but that is not license to threaten you and to steal your property. You know, it wasn't so long ago we used to hang people for stealing. I said, okay, I'm not actually looking for the capital punishment penalty, but I would at least like an acknowledgement that the perpetrator will be dealt with in an appropriate manner. Now, interestingly enough, the people who were involved in that incident came up and did so with their card that I got their license plate from, and I was able to give this to the police, and they chased down the guy who was responsible, and after talking to him they said to me, we're not going to pursue this, we don't think it's in the public interest. So what we're getting is an environment with more and more Muslims coming into our country, getting more and more aggressive and arrogant, and feeling that they can go out on the streets in broad daylight in a major city and tell non-Muslims what they can and cannot do on their own streets in their own hometown. And not only that, but that when that happens, the police take absolutely no notice of any transgressions of that nature if they're carried out by Muslims. If that had been me doing the same thing to a Muslim on the street, I can guarantee my feet wouldn't have touched the ground and I would be up on a racial harassment charge in no time at all. So the development of the Muslim experience, if you like, in the UK has... I won't say it's been less than positive. What I will say is it's been a complete disaster. Who wants people like that anywhere near you? Who wants to have people like that as neighbours? Who wants to have people like that in their own town? And consequently, what happens is that when Muslims become sufficiently populous in an area, anybody who is non-Muslim and who doesn't want to get harassed or to have their children or elderly parents harassed on a daily basis, they just find the opportunity not to be there and they leave. And consequently, places that become largely Muslim very quickly after that become virtually 100% Muslim, because nobody wants Muslims as next door neighbours. They make appalling neighbours wherever they go in Western countries. And my experience, I'm sure, will chime with other people in the UK and, in fact, other people in America and indeed with what Kel was saying in Canada. So I think I can safely say that the experience that we've had here in the UK is arguably worse than has been experienced in Canada, because we have a higher Muslim population. Depending on who you talk to, it's anything between 4 and 6% officially, but then we've probably got a whole bunch of people living there unofficially or undocumented aliens. And so because they are of a higher percentage, they feel they can get away with more arrogant and aggressive behaviour. And if you haven't got that now, in leafy Vermont, you certainly will have as the percentage of Muslims increases. And the same goes for any town or city anywhere in the Western world. When you get Muslims above a certain population, their behaviour changes. Like I said, when I first became aware that there were Muslims in our part of the world, they weren't seen as a threat. They were seen as an exotic component of life's rich tapestry, and if somebody back in the 1970s had coined the word multiculturalism and diversity, we would have said that wasn't a bad thing. But by the time those terms were coined and used in regular conversation from, about 15, 20 years ago, from then, it became associated with, very negative connotations, because multiculturalism, if you examine the concept, is a notion which will eventually lead to the genocide of the indigenous population. And diversity is basically saying that everybody else's culture is at least as good as yours, and you are not to promote your own indigenous culture at the expense of the diverse populations. So over time, we have seen the situation get steadily worse as the Muslim population increases. But as we know from studies done by people like Dr. Peter Hammond, who looked at this phenomenon in pretty much every country around the world, this is what happens when you allow Islam into a Western population. It's not an isolated instance. What I'm describing to you now is, I'm sure, going to resonate with the other people who are going to be talking on this show, but that's my personal perspective. So I've covered probably an awful lot when you just asked me one question, but there you go. That's what I'm like.
That's fine, Tim. In fact, it's exactly what I was looking for. And I believe it was Dr. Hammond who created the article, What Islam Isn't. And I will be putting that up at UBG Contact on Twitter so people can look at that. It is full of some very fascinating figures, and it documents more or less what Tim has just said. but in less of a personal perspective than Tim gave. And Tim, but I want you to delve into the law, because one of the things I found fascinating happened during this attack on yourself when you were campaigning was that when the police officer did catch up to one of the individuals, he basically said that they weren't going to pursue the crime, and some people may call it a trivial crime, but what struck me was that they said they weren't going to pursue it because it was not in the public interest. For all law-abiding citizens, this has to rather grate. An offense is an offense, and one would think that if everyone is equal under the law, regardless of what country you live in, offenses should be dealt with by the law, regardless of whether or not it is in, quote-unquote, the public interest. Offenders should be prosecuted. Now, I want to ask you about civil law, because something has happened in the United Kingdom that some Islamists here in the United States are pushing for, and I think you know what it is, involving the civil courts, do you not?
Yeah, you're talking about Sharia courts and the fact that there are, at the last count, the best part of 100 Sharia courts in the United Kingdom. And they I think the way it was presented originally was that the Sharia courts would take some of the weight off the court system by dealing with matters that related to family, such as domestic disputes or divorce or inheritance, things of that nature. And I think at the time, people in the judicial system thought, well, what could possibly go wrong? Where the courts are overwhelmed, or they certainly were a few years ago, and I believe the situation hasn't improved since then. They have an enormous workload. Justice moves incredibly slowly at the best of times. But the people involved in the judicial process decided that having Sharia law running as a parallel system alongside British law would be a good idea. I mean, after all, the argument went, the Jews have their Beth Din courts, and they seem to operate fine. But of course, the difference between things like the Beth Din courts are everybody goes into them with the understanding that they prefer a settlement under Jewish rules, if you like, but they understand that British law takes primacy, and so if somebody's totally unhappy with the way they're dealt with in a Beth Din court, they can and do have recourse in mainstream British courts. But with Sharia courts, of course, a large number of people who have judgments made against them at these courts are women who come from the third world, places like Pakistan and Bangladesh and Afghanistan and other Muslim countries. And because of their upbringing, they might well be illiterate. They certainly won't understand the legal system here. And they are not told that if they don't like what's happening, they have recourse to British courts. So women who go into courts for family purposes, all right, it sounds very benign on the surface, but the way that Sharia law is interpreted is always disadvantageous to women under those circumstances. Their testimony, for example, is only worth half that of a man. In inheritance cases, their inheritance will only be half that of a man. And when it comes to divorce, a woman has a great difficulty proving the conditions are okay for a divorce, and great difficulty getting through to a Sharia judge that the judgment should be in favour of a woman, unless really serious violence has occurred. If you've beaten your wife almost to the point of death and she's in hospital and she's had all the bruises photographed and medical testimony and so on, well, okay, a Sharia judge might say, well, don't beat her so hard next time. It'll be highly unlikely that a woman will get a divorce just because she's unhappy with her position in life or her position in marriage. And most women do not understand that if they don't like what a Sharia court says, they can go to British courts and get a proper appreciation of their case. So there is a movement afoot to try and reduce the influence of Sharia courts here in the UK. The ideal thing would be to ban them altogether because of the gender inequality that is involved with Sharia law. But the opposition, of course, Muslims are loath to give back anything that they've been given to start with, and so there's a lot of opposition within Muslim groups to keep things the way they are. And for Muslim men, why not? They have the best of all worlds. In Sharia law, if they want a divorce, they just have to say talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, and that's it, done and dusted. You are then divorced. And you can even do it by text or over a mobile phone, and that still counts as a divorce. So it's very disadvantageous to women who might not realise that they've got any kind of redress at all under British law. And so that sort of unjust and discriminatory behaviour is just one reason why we shouldn't even be countenancing Sharia courts over here. Now, we've got people like the Great and the Good, one of the former Archbishops of Canterbury. I think it might have been Rowan... I nearly said Rowan Atkinson. I meant Rowan Williams. Rowan Atkinson was the guy who played Blackadder. Rowan Williams, one of the former Archbishops of Canterbury, he memorably said, well, I think it's inevitable that Sharia law will become part of British law over time. Well, the guy's an idiot, basically, because Sharia law is discriminatory in the ways that I have explained before, and there's no place for it in any Western society. And I think since then, we are starting to get a certain level of awareness amongst our political elite, at least, that all is not as it should be with the concept of Sharia law in this country. And there are more people than there used to be who are speaking out against it. But as things stand at the moment, these courts do exist. They do dispense law on an Islamic basis, and the people who have these judgments against them are frequently not informed that in fact they have redress to British courts. So the entire process is unfair, certainly to women. So that's where we are with that.
All right, Tip. I want to bring in one more thing, and if you can talk briefly on this, the difference between an aggravating circumstance and a mitigating circumstance. Over time, it seems that being a Mohammedan in the United Kingdom, which shouldn't matter at all in the courts one way or the other, has actually become a mitigating circumstance. And I think you can give at least one example, if not one or two, of cases where being a Mohammedan is actually a mitigating circumstance. They actually get better treatment now in British courts than the indigenous people of the United Kingdom, by the way, regardless of what color they are. Please go ahead.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, the two examples that spring to mind, there was a case with I think there were Somali girls, and they attacked a white indigenous British girl in the street, kicked her all over her body, tried pulling her hair out in chunks, and, generally occasioning what would normally be called grievous bodily harm, and which would attract a mandatory jail sentence. And these 4 girls were traced, they were taken to court, and the judge declined to impose a jail sentence. I think he just gave them a suspended sentence. He said, I'm doing this because you're Muslim and you're clearly not used to the effects of alcohol. These girls have been drinking. Obviously, they weren't very good Muslims, but nevertheless, the fact that they were Muslim influenced the judge to decline to impose a custodial sentence, which, of course, many people felt was entirely wrong. And there have been numerous examples of Muslims committing various heinous acts, usually involving either violence to the person in a public place, loads of witnesses, and should attract a jail sentence no matter what, where Muslims have got away with suspended sentences or even just a slap on the wrist. And of course, we all know about the preponderance of Islamic grooming gangs here in the UK, something that's been going on for 15 or 20 years and has been swept under the carpet by various police forces and social services, and all the authorities who should have been doing something about it declined to do anything about it at all for many years because they didn't want to be called racist. And then in the end, when we started getting convictions, predominantly of Muslims, for these heinous acts against thousands of British school children, young vulnerable girls, the sentences that were imposed were frequently derisory. Yeah, absolutely derisory. These are talking about rape, coercion into prostitution, living off immoral earnings, and that's quite apart from the violent aspects at all. And the sentences were, in many cases, much lighter than you would expect if it was a British person who'd been found guilty of the same thing. So there is certainly a mitigating factor if you are Muslim. If you go out and commit a heinous crime involving violence or a sexual crime of some sort, there's a good chance that you will get a sentence if you're caught. And even if you're prosecuted, because of course the police are still reluctant to prosecute Muslims for any sort of wrongdoing at all, unless it's something like, for example, not paying your TV license. Oh, they have no problem with that. But when it comes to really serious crimes, the police are very reluctant to bring charges at all, because it can be seen, if a policeman makes a mistake when he's processing a Muslim for prosecution, that could be the end of his career. The reality on the ground is that the police are disinclined to prosecute for very serious cases because the perpetrators are Muslim. And unless something is done, ultimately the whole of our society is going to be the poorer for it.
In Part 3, I speak to Jeff Mitchell of the English Defence League, where we'll examine what Islamization does to a great city. That's it for this time. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for listening, and may your God go with you. Goodbye. The Unpleasant Blind Guy is copyright 2015, Anno Domini.